In the year April 6, 1930, on the beaches of Dandi, India, thousands gather, hearts pounding, all eyes locked on one man. A man determined and without fear, the peaceful warrior daring to defy the mightiest empire on earth. He steps forward, kneels, scoops salt from the sand. A simple act, yet a direct challenge to an empire ruling millions. A single, explosive act of rebellion. No guns, no violence, just raw courage against impossible odds. The man? Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, a lawyer turned revolutionary, a humble man taking on history's greatest empire without firing a single bullet. But make no mistake, his weapon is truth and his strategy unstoppable. This is the story of how one man's peaceful resistance shook the world and changed history forever. This is the story of Gandhi. Childhood in Porbandar. Gandhi was born on October 2, 1869, in the coastal town of Porbandar, a small yet significant city located in what is now Gujarat, India. The atmosphere here was deeply shaped by traditional Hindu values, which would later play a major role in shaping his worldview. Growing up in a devout family, Gandhi was immersed in the teachings of nonviolence, truth, and the importance of moral integrity. His father, Karamchand Gandhi, was the Dewan Chief Minister of Porbandar, a position that held both political and moral influence. Despite his father's status, the family lived simply, embodying the values they preached. It was under this roof that Gandhi's earliest lessons in humility, honesty, and religious devotion were taught. Gandhi's mother, Putlibai, was a deeply religious woman, and her influence was profound. She was a woman of great faith, whose strength and commitment to prayer made a lasting impact on Gandhi. She would often fast for spiritual clarity, a practice Gandhi himself would later adopt as a form of resistance. Through his mother, Gandhi was exposed to Jain teachings, which strongly influenced his commitment to nonviolence, ahimsa. The principles of Jainism, nonviolence, truth, and the sacredness of all life became the foundation upon which Gandhi built his activism. Even as a young boy, he was profoundly affected by the spiritual depth of his upbringing, and the lessons of faith became intertwined with his growing sense of justice. But childhood in Porbandar wasn't all religious contemplation. Gandhi was also a normal child with typical insecurities. He was painfully shy, a self-acknowledged average student, often hesitant in the company of others. However, it was these very struggles that helped develop his inner resilience. Gandhi was not the brightest student, nor the most popular. Yet, there was always something in him that yearned to prove that, no matter the circumstances, truth could triumph. His family's influence and the moral teachings of his culture would lay the groundwork for a future shaped by radical change. Struggles in England. In 1888, Gandhi traveled to England to study law at University College London. It was a significant step for him, a young Indian man leaving behind his family, his cultural roots, and embarking on a path that seemed far removed from the humble life he had known in India. England, with its sophisticated educational system and deep-rooted colonial mindset, presented a sharp contrast to his upbringing. There, in the heart of the British Empire, Gandhi faced racism and alienation that would go on to shape his activism. As a student in London, he felt the sting of discrimination. He was frequently ridiculed and made to feel inferior simply because of his Indian heritage. These experiences, however painful, began to sow the seeds of his later resistance. In England, Gandhi was exposed to a more global and diverse world than he had encountered in India. He read voraciously, especially works on philosophy, law, and politics. Among the books that shaped him were the writings of Henry David Thoreau, whose essay on civil disobedience deeply resonated with him. Gandhi began to see the link between personal responsibility and social justice. Thoreau's argument that individuals have the moral duty to refuse to obey unjust laws would become one of the cornerstones of Gandhi's philosophy. But despite his intellectual growth, Gandhi's time in England wasn't without difficulty. He often struggled with fitting in, facing deep isolation as a non-European in a society that prized privilege and class. The racism Gandhi encountered would leave an indelible mark on him. However, it was also in these moments of exclusion that Gandhi began to formulate his philosophy of resistance, not through violence, but through a steadfast commitment to truth and nonviolence. He realized that injustice in any form must be fought, not with the weapons of war, but with the weapons of the soul. Influence of Jainism and religious teachings. Returning from England in 1891, Gandhi faced a different India, still entrenched in British rule, but now marked by its growing sense of nationalism. It was during this time that he began to reconsider his earlier religious ideas. The exposure to Jainism, particularly the doctrine of ahimsa, nonviolence, played a crucial role in shaping his thinking. Gandhi had been exposed to Jain teachings as a young boy, but now, as an adult and a lawyer, he would revisit these teachings with a new understanding. Jainism's strict adherence to nonviolence made a profound impression on Gandhi. The idea that one should avoid harm to any living creature, human, animal, or even plant, resonated deeply with him. Gandhi's time in South Africa, where he would later begin his activism, further solidified this philosophy. He was increasingly convinced that nonviolence was not just a personal moral code, but a political strategy. Gandhi realized that if he was to lead India in its struggle for independence, it could not be through violent rebellion, but through a movement grounded in the principle of nonviolence. At the same time, Gandhi's Hindu beliefs, especially those related to self-discipline and renunciation, influenced his thinking. The Bhagavad Gita, a key text in Hindu philosophy, became a source of spiritual and political guidance for him. The text spoke of acting in accordance with one's duty, or dharma, without attachment to the results. For Gandhi, this meant fighting for India's freedom, but without hatred or violence, understanding that the moral victory was as important as the political one. The synthesis of Jainism, Hinduism, and his own experiences with racism and injustice would provide the foundation for the political leader he would become. Gandhi's family and key early figures. Mahatma Gandhi's family played an indispensable role in shaping the man who would lead a revolution of peaceful resistance. His father, Karamchand Gandhi, was a man of integrity who instilled in Gandhi the values of honesty and service. Despite his high-ranking position, Karamchand's humility and ethical code were deeply ingrained in Gandhi's personal philosophy. He taught Gandhi the importance of remaining true to one's principles, no matter the cost. Putlibai, his mother, had a more direct influence on Gandhi's spiritual development. Through her example, Gandhi learned the importance of fasting, prayer, and devotion. Her deeply religious nature had a lasting impact on his moral code. She also taught him the importance of nonviolence, a lesson that would become the cornerstone of his leadership. In England, it wasn't just Gandhi's legal mentors who shaped him. Figures like Leo Tolstoy and John Ruskin were important intellectual influences. Tolstoy's commitment to nonviolence and Ruskin's ideas about self-reliance and labor influenced Gandhi's philosophy deeply. Tolstoy's belief in the sanctity of all life, as well as his commitment to simplicity, resonated with Gandhi's desire for an India free of materialism and exploitation. Ruskin's "Unto This Last," with its argument that the well-being of the poor should be a society's primary focus, inspired Gandhi's later economic philosophy, which placed a heavy emphasis on rural self-sufficiency and the dignity of manual labor. In both India and England, these figures, along with Gandhi's family and his experiences with injustice, laid the foundation for his philosophy of nonviolence. By the time he returned to India in 1915, Gandhi was a man ready to lead, armed with a vision that would challenge an empire without ever lifting a sword. First exposure to racism. In 1893, a young Gandhi found himself on a train, traveling from Durban to Pretoria, South Africa. He was an Indian lawyer, newly arrived in the country, eager to build his career. But on that fateful night, he was about to face something that would change the course of his life forever. As the story goes, Gandhi, holding a first-class ticket, was ordered to vacate his seat and move to a third-class carriage. When he refused, the conductor, with brutal disregard for his rights, physically threw him off the train, leaving him in the cold, dark night on a remote platform. This wasn't just a moment of physical rejection. It was an emotional awakening. Gandhi, who had left India to escape the constraints of his traditional life, suddenly found himself a victim of racial prejudice. South Africa, still entrenched in colonial practices, viewed Indians as inferior. To Gandhi, this wasn't just an isolated incident. It was an attack on his dignity, on his humanity. The sting of discrimination, raw and personal, cut through his soul. This moment marked the beginning of his journey toward activism. It was in that moment of pain that Gandhi first realized the oppressive nature of the system under which he and his people were living. But this incident was also transformative. Rather than succumbing to anger or bitterness, Gandhi's mind began to turn inward, questioning, how could he respond to injustice without resorting to violence? How could he challenge this system without perpetuating the same cycle of hatred and cruelty? The seeds of nonviolent resistance were planted here. For Gandhi, this wasn't just about a train ride. It was a defining moment that steeled his resolve to fight against racial discrimination through means that would later become known as satyagraha, nonviolent resistance. Formation of satyagraha. Gandhi's years in South Africa were marked by his growing understanding of injustice and his desire to confront it in a way that was uniquely his own. The term satyagraha, meaning truth force, was coined by Gandhi during this time, though it would not fully take form until later in India. Satyagraha wasn't just a strategy, it was a philosophy, a way of life. It was about resisting oppression through peaceful means, through the sheer power of truth. Gandhi believed that all people, no matter their background, had an inner truth that could not be denied. Nonviolence wasn't simply about avoiding physical harm. It was about acting in alignment with one's highest moral values, even in the face of brutal oppression. Gandhi's first large-scale implementation of satyagraha came in 1906 during his campaign against the Black Act, a law in South Africa that required Indian residents to register with the government and carry a passbook. The law was a direct infringement on their rights, reducing them to second-class citizens in their own land. Gandhi called for a peaceful, non-violent protest, urging his fellow Indians to resist the law by refusing to register. This was no ordinary protest. Gandhi's approach was not to destroy or defy for the sake of defiance. He sought to change the hearts of both the oppressed and the oppressors. The concept of satyagraha was about suffering rather than inflicting harm, about choosing to bear the injustices rather than retaliate in anger. Gandhi knew the only way to make the British authorities take notice was not through violent rebellion, but through unwavering, peaceful resistance. Thousands of Indian immigrants, from businessmen to farm laborers, joined Gandhi's movement, each making their own personal sacrifice for the cause. In doing so, they showed that nonviolent protest wasn't a passive act. It was an active, powerful force. The Transvaal Campaign and the Natal Indian Congress. By 1907, Gandhi's message was beginning to spread throughout the Indian immigrant communities of South Africa. In the region of Transvaal, where the oppression was most severe, Gandhi's campaign reached its pinnacle. His efforts culminated in a massive confrontation with the British colonial government. Gandhi, leading his community, organized one of the largest peaceful protests against the discriminatory pass laws and other oppressive measures. The movement escalated. Indian citizens refused to carry the passes, burned registration cards in public demonstrations, and refused to obey the unjust laws that governed their daily lives. During this time, Gandhi's legal expertise and his deep understanding of human nature allowed him to strategize in ways that made his movement stand out. It wasn't just about disobedience. It was about the spiritual awakening that came with the struggle. Gandhi taught his followers that their actions should be motivated by love and compassion, even for those who oppress them. This was a stark contrast to the typical methods of rebellion and resistance. The goal wasn't to defeat the oppressor, but to awaken them to the truth of their actions. In response, the British authorities cracked down hard on the protests. Gandhi and hundreds of his followers were imprisoned, but their spirit was unbroken. The Natal Indian Congress, which Gandhi had founded in 1894, played a pivotal role in organizing and consolidating the resistance. The Congress became the platform from which Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolence spread not only through South Africa, but also to other parts of the world. The victories of the movement came slowly, piecemeal, but they came nonetheless. The British government, seeing the resilience and moral authority of Gandhi and his followers, was eventually forced to negotiate. By 1914, after years of struggle, Gandhi had successfully negotiated with the British to repeal the most oppressive laws, and the Indian community was granted basic rights. This was a historic moment, not just for South Africa, but for Gandhi's future political career. What began as a struggle for personal dignity transformed into a broader movement for equality, one that would reverberate across the globe. Indian immigrants and British authorities. The Indian immigrant community in South Africa was integral to Gandhi's campaign. They were the ones who had the most to lose, and yet they stood by him. These were not elites, but ordinary men and women, indentured workers, small-time traders, and farmers who had come to South Africa seeking a better life. But the system had left them marginalized and oppressed. Gandhi's message of nonviolence gave them the strength to stand together, to rise above the violence they faced daily, and to push back with the one weapon they could wield: peaceful resistance. The British colonial officials, on the other hand, played the role of the antagonists in this struggle. They had the power of the law, the strength of the military, and a belief in their own racial superiority. Yet Gandhi saw them not as enemies to be crushed, but as misguided souls in need of moral awakening. He believed that the British, like the oppressed, were part of the same human family, and that their oppression was just as harmful to their own souls. As the campaign gained momentum, the British authorities grew increasingly desperate. They resorted to harsh tactics, imprisonment, beatings, and surveillance. But Gandhi and his followers remained unshaken. Through this struggle, Gandhi learned that true leadership didn't come from wielding power, but from empowering others. It was this very lesson that would serve as the foundation for his leadership of India's struggle for independence. South Africa was the testing ground for everything that Gandhi would later implement on a much larger scale in India. It was here that the philosophies of nonviolence and truth began to take their full shape. The resistance against oppressive laws, the peaceful protests, and the moral victories Gandhi achieved formed the backbone of the principles he would later take to India's fight for independence. What began as a personal struggle for dignity evolved into a movement that changed the world forever. Through his experiences in South Africa, Gandhi didn't just learn how to resist injustice. He learned how to do so without becoming the very thing he fought against. Gandhi's return to India. In 1915, after years of struggle and triumph in South Africa, Gandhi returned to his homeland, India. The India he returned to, however, was a nation deeply divided, colonized, poor, and under the brutal control of the British Empire. Gandhi was no longer the unknown lawyer who had once been thrown off a train in South Africa. He was a leader, a symbol of hope for millions. His return was met with enthusiasm. The streets were filled with crowds of people who had heard of his work, his nonviolence, and his defiance against the British in South Africa. For Gandhi, however, his return was not a moment of celebration. It was the beginning of a greater mission. His first steps back on Indian soil were not marked by fanfare or the welcoming of a hero, but by a realization: The India he had imagined in his youth was far from the truth. The peasants lived in misery under the rule of the British, their lands being taxed, their lives exploited. India needed change, and Gandhi's heart told him that change had to come from the most fundamental of ideas: truth and nonviolence. Gandhi's first months in India were spent traveling, speaking to people in cities and villages, learning about their struggles. The more he saw, the more he understood. The British Empire wasn't just an occupying force. It was a system that thrived on the exploitation of the poor. And so, in 1915, Gandhi set out on a journey to transform India, using the very tools he had honed in South Africa: satyagraha, nonviolent resistance, and truth. The Champaran Satyagraha, 1917. In 1917, Gandhi's first opportunity to challenge British imperialism in India came when he led the Champaran Satyagraha. The Champaran district, located in the state of Bihar, was home to hundreds of poor Indian farmers who were being forced to grow indigo for British planters under oppressive terms. The planters, most of them British, had implemented a system called the Tinkathia system, forcing farmers to grow indigo on a portion of their land and sell it at prices dictated by the British. The farmers were left with little land for their own crops, and the British monopolized the profits. When Gandhi arrived in Champaran, he saw firsthand the cruel treatment that the farmers endured. The British authorities tried to intimidate Gandhi, warning him that his involvement in the protest would lead to violent consequences. But Gandhi, true to his principles, stood firm, insisting that he would not leave until justice was served. Gandhi's approach to the situation was groundbreaking. Instead of organizing a violent rebellion or protest, he led a campaign based on nonviolent civil disobedience. He mobilized the farmers, urging them to refuse to comply with the unjust system. It wasn't just about opposing the taxes or unfair laws. It was about asserting the dignity and rights of the people, about demanding respect for their labor and land. Gandhi's leadership inspired the farmers to stand up, not with weapons, but with their unwavering resolve. They refused to pay the taxes until the government came to terms. After months of peaceful protests, the British government finally relented. The Champaran Satyagraha was a resounding victory for Gandhi and the Indian peasants. This victory not only boosted the morale of the Indian people, but it also proved the power of nonviolence. Gandhi's reputation as a leader who could deliver real change without resorting to violence began to spread. The movement was more than just about the indigo planters. It was a symbol of resistance, a call to the masses that they too had power to stand up against oppression, as long as they did so through the truth of nonviolence. The Kheda Satyagraha, 1918. 2 years after the success of Champaran, Gandhi led another significant campaign, this time in Kheda, a district in Gujarat. The Indian farmers in Kheda were suffering under a heavy tax burden, exacerbated by a failed harvest that had left the peasants impoverished. The British government refused to reduce the taxes, despite the hardship faced by the farmers. Gandhi, seeing that the farmers had nowhere to turn, again launched a non-violent movement to resist the unfair taxation. In Kheda, Gandhi applied the same principles that had worked in Champaran. The farmers refused to pay the taxes, demanding a reduction of the rates due to their inability to pay because of the failed crops. Once again, Gandhi used satyagraha not just as a strategy for protest, but as a moral stance. He encouraged the people of Kheda to demonstrate their resistance with dignity and patience. The key was not to confront the authorities with anger, but to remain peaceful and resolute in their beliefs. The Kheda movement garnered national attention and eventually forced the British government to relent. The tax rates were reduced and the peasants were granted some relief. Gandhi's success in Kheda further cemented his reputation as a leader of mass resistance, who could enact change without violence. It also showcased his unique ability to unite diverse groups of people, Hindus, Muslims, and people from various castes, under a common cause of justice. The impact of Kheda extended beyond the immediate success. It was a profound demonstration of how nonviolence could be used not just for social justice, but for political mobilization. Gandhi had proven that even in the face of harsh opposition, an entire community could resist through their commitment to truth and peaceful action. This victory laid the groundwork for larger movements that would eventually culminate in India's struggle for independence. Nonviolent resistance and mass mobilization. By 1919, Gandhi's name had become synonymous with resistance, and his message was clear. Nonviolence is the most powerful weapon for social and political change. In both Champaran and Kedah, he had proven that satyagraha wasn't just a philosophy. It was a practical, effective tool for mass mobilization. Gandhi had created a model for mass resistance that was founded on truth and nonviolence, a model that could be adopted by ordinary people in their fight for justice. But Gandhi didn't stop at organizing protests for the peasants. His vision for India's future went far beyond simply challenging British policies. It was about creating an empowered, self-reliant India, where every person, regardless of their caste or religion, would have an equal voice. Gandhi's leadership was not just about opposing British colonial rule, but about instilling a sense of unity and collective action in the Indian people. Gandhi's ability to inspire and mobilize masses was one of his greatest strengths. In the years that followed, he would go on to lead some of the most significant movements in India's history. He united the people of India, not through speeches alone, but through his personal commitment to truth and his willingness to suffer alongside them. His methods were never about instilling fear. They were about awakening the moral consciousness of the masses, showing them that their greatest strength lay in their nonviolent resistance. As Gandhi's reputation grew, so did the scope of his mission. From his early days in South Africa to his leadership of the independence movement in India, Gandhi had become the face of nonviolent resistance. The salt tax, a symbol of oppression. By 1930, the Indian people had endured over 200 years of colonial rule. While the British Empire had built its wealth on India's land and resources, one of the most oppressive forms of control was the salt tax. Salt, an essential part of the Indian diet, was being taxed by the British, who maintained a monopoly on its production. Indians, who had been making salt for centuries from the sea, were suddenly forced to purchase it from the British government at inflated prices, with a portion of that money going to enrich colonial officials. The salt tax was more than just a financial burden. It was a symbol of the British Empire's complete control over India. It wasn't just about the salt, it was about the right to basic necessities. Gandhi, ever the strategist, saw the salt tax as the perfect symbol for resistance. It affected everyone, rich or poor, farmer or businessman, making it a unifying cause. Gandhi was a master at recognizing the symbolic power of simple things. To defy the salt tax was not merely to protest an unfair law. It was to take a stand against the British grip on India's very soul. The injustice was clear. The British had forced the Indian people to pay for something they had always freely produced. Gandhi's satyagraha was not just a political struggle, but a moral one. And in 1930, he decided it was time to take this fight to the streets in the most public and defiant way possible, through the Salt March. The 240-mile march, a historic act of defiance. On March 12, 1930, Gandhi set out from Sabarmati Ashram in Ahmedabad, leading a group of 78 followers on a 240-mile journey to the coastal town of Dandi, where he planned to make salt from the sea, directly violating British law. The Salt March, though seemingly simple, would become one of the most significant acts of defiance in India's struggle for independence. Gandhi's choice of salt was deliberate. It was something everyone could relate to, something that connected the rich man in the city with the poorest farmer in the countryside. Gandhi knew that the British Empire's hold on India depended not just on their military might, but on their control over the everyday life of the Indian people. The Salt March would make it impossible for the British to ignore the growing unrest. As Gandhi began his march, The crowds that gathered were not just spectators, they were part of a movement. Word spread quickly, and people from all walks of life joined in. Gandhi's message of nonviolent resistance resonated deeply with those who had never before considered taking a stand. It wasn't just a march against salt, it was a march against the entire colonial system. Along the way, Gandhi delivered speeches to local communities, urging them to take action peacefully and without hatred. His leadership style was magnetic, calm, patient, but determined. As he walked, Gandhi would engage people in conversation, explaining the importance of standing up for one's rights while maintaining the moral high ground. The message was clear. Nonviolence was not a passive act, but an active and powerful form of resistance. The media took notice. International reporters followed the march, capturing the sights and sounds of a peaceful resistance movement that was gaining global attention. As Gandhi and his followers approached Dandi, the eyes of the world were on them. This was no longer just a protest, it was a symbol of defiance, a rallying cry for every Indian suffering under British rule. Massive public response, the national awakening. The Salt March wasn't just a turning point for Gandhi's movement, it was a turning point for India. By the time Gandhi and his followers reached Dandi on April 6, 1930, to make their own salt from the sea, the march had become a national event. Across India, people rallied behind Gandhi's message. In every village, every city, workers, farmers, and students all began to defy the British salt laws. People made their own salt, sold it in the markets, and stood against the unjust law. Gandhi had turned a single act of defiance into a movement, and it was catching fire. The British colonial government, unable to control the rising tide of dissent, responded with what they knew best: repression. Yet, in their attempt to quell the movement, they inadvertently magnified its power. When Gandhi reached Dandi and broke the salt law by making salt from the sea, the world was watching. The peaceful act of making salt had become a powerful image of resistance. Gandhi had successfully transformed a simple, everyday action into a global symbol of the fight for freedom. The international media covered the Salt March in detail, drawing attention to the injustice of British rule. Gandhi was no longer just a leader in India. He had become a global figure, symbolizing nonviolent resistance as the most powerful weapon against oppression. But while the world praised his courage, the British were not ready to back down. Violent crackdowns, British response, and the cost of nonviolence. The British response to the Salt March was swift and brutal. As the movement spread, colonial authorities cracked down, arresting thousands of protesters. Gandhi, ever the strategist, understood the cost of this fight. He had warned his followers that nonviolence would require great sacrifice, and they were now paying the price. The British police responded with force, violently suppressing protests, arresting leaders, and using physical violence against peaceful protesters. The brutality of the British response, captured by reporters and photographers, became a central element of the movement's narrative. In one particularly infamous incident, peaceful demonstrators were mercilessly beaten with lapis sticks as they walked to protest the salt tax. The images of nonviolent protesters being beaten by British officers sent shockwaves through India and the world. Gandhi's movement had always been about nonviolence, but this blatant brutality galvanized the Indian population. The violence of the British was a clear example of their cruelty, while Gandhi's refusal to retaliate showed the strength of his principles. Gandhi's movement was no longer just about salt. It was about human dignity and justice. The response to the British crackdown was not just a call to resist the salt tax. It was a rallying cry for freedom itself. As more leaders, including Jawaharlal Nehru, Subhas Chandra Bose, and Sardar Patel, joined Gandhi's efforts, the movement evolved into a mass national movement. The Salt March had proven that nonviolence could be the answer to oppression. Gandhi's followers and British authorities. Gandhi's followers were integral to the success of the Salt March. Leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru and Sardar Patel were not just Gandhi's closest allies, they were also embodiments of the movement's core values. Nehru, who would go on to become India's first prime minister, was a tireless advocate for independence. Patel, known for his organizational acumen, played a crucial role in mobilizing the masses and ensuring the movement maintained its peaceful, non-violent nature. These leaders, along with thousands of ordinary Indians, were united under Gandhi's leadership, each willing to face arrest, violence, and hardship for the sake of India's freedom. The British authorities were portrayed as the antagonists in this struggle. From Lord Irwin, the Viceroy of India, who initially dismissed Gandhi as a wild dreamer, to the officers who physically beat protesters, the British response was one of increasing repression. They had failed to understand Gandhi's strength, his ability to inspire millions of people, not through force or violence, but through moral clarity and the unwavering power of nonviolence. Gandhi's legacy and the global attention. The Salt March and the violent crackdown that followed thrust India's struggle for independence into the global spotlight. What began as a protest against an unjust tax on salt became a symbol of nonviolent resistance that resonated far beyond India's borders. The movement demonstrated that the power of the people could not be suppressed, even under the weight of British military force. Gandhi's unique approach to resistance, the commitment to truth and nonviolence, created a blueprint for future movements, not just in India, but across the world. The Salt March was not just a turning point in the Indian independence movement. It was a moment of global significance, showing that even against an empire as vast and powerful as the British, the moral force of nonviolence could challenge oppression in ways that violence never could. It was a moment of awakening, both for India and the world. Gandhi had set into motion the beginning of the end for British colonial rule in India, and the Salt March became one of the most iconic acts of resistance in history. The Partition of India, 1947, a nation divided. By 1947, after decades of struggle, the British finally agreed to grant India independence. But this victory came at a staggering cost. The peaceful ideals Gandhi had fought for were shattered by the brutal reality of partition. The division of India into two separate nations, India and Pakistan. The decision was made hastily and without regard for the millions of people who lived along the new borders, splitting religious communities and leaving deep wounds that would last for generations. Gandhi, who had devoted his life to uniting his country under the banner of nonviolence, now found himself facing the bitter reality of religious and political violence. As the partition lines were drawn, violence erupted across the subcontinent. Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs found themselves forced to flee their homes, seeking refuge in the new nations, and violence followed in their wake. The bloodshed was horrific. Estimates suggest that up to 2 million people were killed in the religious riots that followed. Gandhi, deeply disturbed by the violence, saw the partition not as a triumph of independence, but as a tragic betrayal of the very ideals he had spent his life preaching. Despite his failing health, Gandhi embarked on a relentless campaign for peace. He moved between riot-torn cities, trying to mediate, speaking to leaders on both sides, urging them to call for calm. But his calls were met with indifference by many. The political leaders of the time, like Jawaharlal Nehru, who would become India's first prime minister, and Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the leader of Pakistan, were too focused on consolidating power in their new nations to heed his message. As India was ripped apart by sectarian violence, Gandhi remained a symbol of unity and peace, though his voice was increasingly drowned out by the growing chaos. His dream of an independent India, united in peace and harmony, was slipping through his fingers. Yet, even in the face of this violence, Gandhi held firm to his principles, refusing to compromise on his belief that non-violence was the only path forward. Gandhi's fasts, a desperate plea for peace. In the face of the violent partition, Gandhi resorted to his last form of protest, fasting. Throughout his life, fasting had been a tool for self-purification, a way to seek clarity and strength. But in his final years, fasting became his only weapon to fight the hatred and violence that consumed the newly formed nations. His fasts were not just personal acts of endurance, they were public calls for peace. They were his final, desperate plea for the people of India and Pakistan to abandon violence and embrace the unity he had envisioned. In 1947, as communal riots tore through the streets of Delhi, Gandhi began his first hunger strike to protest the violence between Hindus and Muslims. He was determined to show the people that no victory, no matter how politically or militarily significant, was worth the bloodshed. His health had already begun to deteriorate, but his resolve remained unshaken. He went without food for several days until the people of Delhi, moved by his suffering and his message, promised to end the violence. Despite his physical weakness, Gandhi continued his efforts. In January 1948, as the violence between the communities continued, Gandhi once again began a hunger strike. This time, it was in the heart of the divided nation. He had a message for the leaders of India, for Nehru, Patel, and others. They could not let the divisions of religion and politics destroy the soul of the country. For Gandhi, this wasn't just a political struggle, it was a spiritual one. He believed that India could only be truly independent if it was also united in peace, with no one group dominating another. Yet, even as he fasted, the violence did not stop. Gandhi's health began to decline rapidly. His final fast, aimed at promoting peace between Hindus and Muslims, was a haunting reminder of the price of his ideals. It was clear that the nonviolence Gandhi had so strongly believed in was being tested in ways he never imagined. The assassination, a tragic end. On January 30th, 1948, as Gandhi walked through the gardens of Birla House in New Delhi, the unthinkable happened. Nathuram Godse, a Hindu nationalist who believed Gandhi was too lenient toward Muslims, stepped forward and shot Gandhi 3 times in the chest. Gandhi, shocked but still conscious, whispered the words, "Hey Ram, oh God," before collapsing to the ground. The news of Gandhi's assassination spread like wildfire across India and the world. The shock and grief were immediate. How could the man who had fought for peace and unity, who had given everything to the cause of nonviolence, be killed by a fellow Indian, a follower of Hinduism? The assassination was a devastating blow, not only to Gandhi's family, but to the soul of the nation. For many, Gandhi's death marked the end of an era. India's political landscape was shifting, and though Gandhi's vision had been a cornerstone of the independence movement, the nation was now moving in a different direction. Political pragmatism had begun to replace the moral vision Gandhi had championed. Jawaharlal Nehru, Gandhi's close friend and ally, would go on to lead India as its first prime minister. But without Gandhi's guidance, the new nation faced challenges that would prove difficult to overcome. Jawaharlal Nehru and Nathuram Godse. Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India, had a complicated relationship with Gandhi in his final years. While Nehru was a devoted follower of Gandhi, the two men often disagreed on key political strategies. Nehru, a product of India's emerging political elite, was more pragmatic and more willing to make compromises than Gandhi was. Despite their differences, Nehru respected Gandhi deeply. Upon Gandhi's death, Nehru gave one of the most moving speeches of his career, calling Gandhi the father of the nation. However, in the years that followed, Nehru's government would face challenges that Gandhi had warned about, including the rise of political factions that would continue to challenge his vision of a unified, peaceful India. Nathuram Godse, the man who assassinated Gandhi, was driven by his belief that Gandhi's efforts to promote Hindu-Muslim unity were a betrayal of the Hindu cause. He believed that Gandhi's insistence on nonviolence and his efforts to appease Muslims were weakening the Hindu identity in India. Gandhi's assassination of Gandhi revealed the dangerous extremes that could emerge in a newly independent nation, where old divisions between religions and ideologies were still very much alive. Gandhi's act of violence was a tragic irony. Gandhi's life had been dedicated to creating a society where violence was rejected in favor of peace and dialogue. But in the end, it was violence, a single act of hatred that would end his life. The emotional, physical, and spiritual toll on Gandhi. The final years of Gandhi's life were marked by both personal and national tragedy. His health, already fragile from years of fasting, deteriorated further as he witnessed the unfolding violence during partition. His refusal to condone the violence around him, even in the face of growing animosity, took a heavy toll on his body. But it was not just his physical health that suffered. It was his spiritual well-being. Gandhi's commitment to nonviolence meant that he could not resort to the tools of power that other leaders were using to shape India's future. He could not force the people to listen. He could not compel the leaders to follow his vision. And as the violence escalated, Gandhi's own doubts began to surface. Was nonviolence truly enough? Could one man, no matter how noble his ideals, stop the tide of history with nothing but his faith in peace? Despite the toll, Gandhi held firm. He refused to abandon his principles, even in the face of immense personal sacrifice. His final fasts were an act of unwavering commitment to his vision of peace. Yet, even as his body grew weaker, the spiritual strength of his belief in nonviolence remained unbroken. His death, in many ways, symbolized the very cost of those beliefs, the willingness to sacrifice everything for the greater good. Gandhi's final years were a profound test of his ideals. The cost of nonviolence, especially in a country torn apart by religious and political divisions, was clear. It was a cost that ultimately took his life. But in his death, Gandhi's message of peace, nonviolence, and truth lived on, continuing to inspire generations around the world. His assassination was a tragic end to a life dedicated to peace, but it also solidified his place as one of the most influential figures in modern history.